half whiteboard. So, we will go ahead and get started. Oh yeah, we need the thing over there. So we are continuing in our series on political theology. We've called the series Render Unto Caesar, one of the more famous verses that deals with political theology. We had an introduction, and then we've been going through some foundational questions for political theology. We'll revisit those really quickly in the beginning. And then we're going to dive into kind of, I think, the fourth major question that we need to engage with as we develop political theology. Then next week, I thought I was going to combine them, and I realized I can't. Presbyterians talking less is not something that's bound to happen anytime soon. So next week will be history. It'll be church history, just how has the church answered this question through the ages. We will give an unusual amount of focus on the American experiment, the American Republic. So probably half the class will just be the history of Christianity in America, the history of the relationship between Christianity to the civil magistrate in America. So that'll be about half the class, given that this is where God's put us. This is our country, this is our nation. And we're going to kind of look through the developments, how these things have happened, and then the next 4 weeks after that will be the four major schools, the four major answers. This is happening faster and faster these days. So I don't know if there's a fix for this. The four major schools being magisterial, two kingdom. Then after that, what we would call sphere sovereignty. After that, then theonomy. And then last, what we would call real, sometimes pejorative, referred to as radical, two kingdoms. After we have the four questions, we've developed answers, we've looked at history, and we've kind of thought the schools. Then our intern, Caleb Graham, I'll do a short introduction, then Caleb Graham's going to talk specifically about Christian nationalism, the venue, the way we're going to, because I've been going through a lot of books. The book in particular that Caleb's going to be talking about is A Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe. And then we'll have a summary final class that will, in addition to summarizing everything we've talked about, we'll also focus on what does it mean to be a good citizen, what are actual practical ways for us as Christians to engage with these ideas. This class is called Government and Judgment. The fourth question is basically how does God judge a government, a civil magistrate, and a nation? Right? How is God, what rubric is God using, and therefore we ought to use to judge the relative performance of a government, of a nation, of a civil magistrate. So as in summary, the questions we've answered so far, there's been three big questions. The first question was, what was the end of government? And by end, we don't mean closing time. We mean telos, purpose. Or, what should a good government create? We had some smaller questions to examine that, right? Is the government a pre-fall or post-fall institution? How do we understand the dominion mandate? What does it mean for Christ to be king? But at the end of the day, what is the end of government? If the government does its job correctly, what will be produced? That's a big question in political theology, and there's disagreement in Protestant political theology. The second question is, what directs government policy? How does a civil magistrate know to make his decisions? And that's a debate between special and general revelation. One of the things we asserted is that Protestants hold to both. There's no position which is totally one or the other, but there is a scale on how we understand that. Last week we talked about what authority does the government have? Really, what ought the government be publishing and promoting? We used the first table of the law as a case study. Should the government punish the first table of the law, which is to say the first four laws of the Ten Commandments? And what we did was we used the previous questions to answer that, right? What is government supposed to look like? Where does it get its direction from? And we saw how you can make arguments from the Bible in favor of punishing the first table of law, and you can make biblical arguments against it. And you can make natural law arguments in favor of punishing the first table of law. We actually talked that that is not the majority, but it is the plurality opinion in the history of specifically Reformed political theology, is that natural law is what governs us, but we should also then punish the first table. And then obviously you can make a natural law argument against punishing the first table of the law. So we arrived now at our fourth and final question. I believe in the handout, in the flyer, the schedule it was, is the government a moral agent? Right? Does God judge governments? Does he judge civil magistrates? Does he judge nations? Does he just judge individuals? I think this is the question that's least investigated, but will actually result in the most specificity of your opinion, because it's getting down to really specifics. There's a phrase here, a corporate moral person. That's one of the answers. It's not necessarily the right answer, but I want to break down a couple phrases. It's really good to define terms before we start making arguments. And so the first question is, what is a nation? When the Bible uses the phrase nation, can you even think, there's a lot of verses that are pretty well known. There's one very, very well verse that uses the word nation in it that particularly refers to the missions of Christians in this world.
1 Peter, we're a holy nation.
That's a great one. 1 Peter, that's not the one I was thinking of, but they're a good one. You therefore are a holy nation unto God and a kingdom of priests. So what does Peter mean by nation? And is it the same thing that Jesus means when he says, go ye therefore unto the nations? Right? Defining what the Bible means when it says nation is extremely important in political theology and often underserved. This is a low quality, I didn't realize it was going to be that blurry, picture of the Treaty of Vienna. And so in history, the Treaty of Vienna is what Europe comes to post-Napoleon. And so, the most important thing as Americans, this is going to hurt our feelings, but the most important thing to happen in the world between the years of 1750 and 1850 is probably the Napoleonic Wars. I know America's awesome. We kind of become important later. No one in 1805 in Europe is really thinking about us. I know it hurts our feelings. They're thinking about Napoleon all the time. Napoleon literally changes the map of Europe forever. There are whole new countries and nations. We're probably aware, there was a protest recently, a No Kings protest. You guys heard about this? And it was astonishingly successful because as of right now, there are no kings in the United States of America. So, top 10 protests, right? They successfully made sure there's no kings. We are aware, however, that European nations have kings. We're probably most familiar with the British royal family, which is, for whatever reason, a very popular celebrity du jour in American culture. King Charles III, not popular. His daughter-in-law, very popular. Spain has a monarchy. Monaco, maybe if we're thinking about monarchies, famous and American because the Prince of Monaco married Grace Kelly, who was a very famous American actress. Sweden has a monarchy. There is currently a king of Sweden. And aside from the king of Monaco, the king of Sweden probably plays the biggest role. It's still very performative and celebratory. But the king of Sweden basically has a say in appointing the different ministers. We would call them like secretaries, Secretary of State, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. The king of Sweden actually gets to advise who those people are, which is more than most kings get to do. The king of Sweden is French. He is a direct descendant of Marshal Bernadette, and how we say it in English. So Marshal Bernadette was one of Napoleon's favorite generals, and he conquers Sweden, and he goes, well, now I get to pick your king, and I pick Marshal Bernadette. And so he posted up in Sweden. At this treaty, that man in between, this is kind of like the Last Supper and the whole Da Vinci Code thing. You see there's a man sitting in white. That's the Emperor of Austria, which is the kind of the wealthiest Austro-Hungarian empire. In between him and the guy in the blue, my understanding is that's Marshal Bernadette, the king of Sweden. So they've gotten rid of Napoleon, the usurper. They're resetting the European map. But the previous king of Sweden's dead. So the Swedish people need a king because they're not a republic. This is 1815. They're not going to go back. They're going to have a democracy. So who does Sweden pick as their new king? And the answer is the same guy. So the kings of Sweden right now are directly descendant from this French general that conquered them 150, not that long ago. He was just so good at it that they wanted to keep him. I just find that fascinating, by the way. Like imagine if Mexico conquered us right now and then we eventually won the war and then just kept the Mexican king running our country. That's what happened. The point here is that what happens in Europe through these wars, through the 60 Years' War and the Napoleonic War, completely changes the way that what the Western world views countries. For all of human history, a nation and a state were totally different ideas. A nation, and I'm going to argue overwhelmingly biblically, pretty much all Reformed political theologians would agree with this. nations are people groups, right? So when it talks about a nation, it's talking about a ethnic, linguistic group of human beings. We still use the word that way in America. Does anyone know in reference to what? It's usually the blank nation. First Nations, so the Native Americans. So the Navajo Indian Reservation is referred to legally as the Navajo Nation. And that doesn't, and you know what the Navajo Nation is not, is a totally sovereign entity. They don't get to declare war on nobody. They don't have an army. They're kind of an independent entity. It's very complex. But the Navajo, the First Nations, the Cherokee Nation, the Tohono O'odham Nation, I'm thinking of the Hopi Nation, what we're referring to there is that ethnic group. The Navajo Nation refers to the Navajo peoples. And that's overwhelmingly the way the Bible uses it. Specifically, 1 Peter is a proof text of this, where he says that Christians are a holy nation. Well, Christians don't have a shared civil magistrate across all of the nations, right? Actually, we're subject to a ton of different ones. How are we a nation? And the answer is because God's creating, he's using that idea of ethnos and lingua franca to say, you are now like one of these nations. And whereas the Navajo are combined by their Navajo language, the Navajo culture, Navajo relationships, all these kind of things, you now are a new nation, but you're a holy nation, right? You've been made a nation of peoples based on Christ and what he's done for you. So I think it's very important when we talk about, the nation, right? What are we saying God's judging? And we actually have to answer 3 questions in this one, just to make it more confusing. Does God judge nations as in groups of people? As in like ethnos, as in ethnic people? Does God judge ethnic peoples? The second question is, does God judge states? So after the Treaty of Westphalia, which ends the 60 Years' War, that's the big war between the Protestants and the Catholics after the Reformation, and then especially after the Treaty of Vienna, for the first time you hear something called a nation state. Because after, especially the Napoleonic War, now all of a sudden there's this understanding that we actually ought to be combining them into one thing, right? That France is a nation state because it's made up of the French nation, the French peoples who speak French, talk French. To quote that great work of American philosophy, The Simpsons, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, I think groundskeeper Willie calls the French. So whatever the French are, they are a nation, but especially after the Napoleonic Wars, they're also a state. There's a French state now that's responsible for looking after the needs of the French people. You hear this often sometimes described as nationalism, right? And so nationalism is really an invention of the post-Napoleonic Code, because before then, what you have is massive empires governing many nations. And the great example of this was the Holy Roman Empire, which was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire. But what are you going to do? The Holy Roman Empire had Polish people, the Polish nation, the Bohemian nation, Bavarian. My family is very German, and my great-grandmother would tell you Bavarians are not Germans, they're Bavarians. It's very different. She was very insistent on that. This is actually what happened, a lot of you are pretty young, in the 90s. A lot of the Serbian peoples and Slavic peoples in Eastern Europe were all under one big pan-nation state, Yugoslavia. But inside of it, there were a ton of different ethnic groups, and they don't like each other. Historically and to this day, there's still a lot of tension there. And so those kind of wars, Slobodan Milosevic, Bill Clinton, was kind of a litigation of this idea. Why are Serbs telling Croats what to do or vice versa? So nationalism nowadays is often used as like a scare word, right? Because there was once a group called the Nationalist Socialist Party, and if you don't know this, they were very, very bad people. They were quite awful. And so we tend to associate nationalism necessarily with National Socialists. But nationalism is quite simply the idea that a state should be national, that there should be a government of a certain people group for a certain people group. And that's what the First Nations are right now. The job of the Navajo Nation is not to look after the needs of the Hopi Nation. It's not to look after my needs. The one point of the Navajo Nation is to care for the Navajo Nation. And so this is an argument for nationalism. It's just an explanation that this is how the world works. It's worked especially post-Napoleon. And this was really important, by the way, because Napoleon famously is not French, right? Napoleon is Corsican. He spoke very bad French his entire life. And so that's part of the reason, by the way, they start pushing nationalism, is it's kind of a way to kick Napoleon while he's down. Like, he wasn't even a French dude, and you listen to him. And so what is a nation? A nation is a group of people. What is a state? A state is a federated government. And then a civil magistrate, that's the term we've been using, because a civil magistrate is God's officer or minister for God's means, which in Romans 13 are laid out as the sword for evil and a blessing for good. And so the civil magistrate is kind of our theological term for the office that's supposed to govern society. A state is the apparatus, the government that does exist, right? And then the nation is the people group. And we've arrived at a point now in history where all three of those things are basically the same thing now. That's why there's a lot of confusion, right? Is basically now in America we have a nation and a state and a civil magistrate, especially because of federalism, right? The president is the civil magistrate. He's also the head of the American nation, and he's also the head of the American state. I want to unpack that because in this one, when we say, how does God judge, which one of these things is he judging? Is he judging the Anglo-Saxons, right? Is he judging the bureaucratic apparatus that is the state, or is he judging the civil magistrate theologically? And your answers on those really change things. Kinism, which is a new word for racism, basically because the word racism has become kind of, it's hard to use that word anymore because now, progressive agenda has labeled everything racist, right? And so if you don't buy a Bad Bunny CD after the Super Bowl, you're a racist. Okay, well now we don't know what racism is. We know traditionally what racism is clearly sinful. It's clearly against God's order that there's one tribe, one nation, there's a new nation of people. And to judge people not based on their moral law keeping, but based on their appearance, their melanin count, their language is sinful. The church has held that forever. But because the term racism has been handed out like candy on a street, the new term that we generally use for this bad idea, kinism, is that your nation, your ethnos, affects your moral standing before God and your moral standing before other people. And so that's what we mean when we say kinism. Do we have any Southerners here? No. Kind of my wife? Your kin are your people, right? These are my kin. Southerners still use that phrase. So if you're going to argue that God judges people based on things like their melanin count, their language, the verbs that they use, and that those things contribute to God's opinion of them or our opinion of them, we call that kinism, and there's 1,000 reasons why that's sinful and incorrect. So when we say, how does God judge a nation, right, what Reformed Protestant political theology is saying, the word nation there, right, is going to be a stand-in for the civil magistrate and for the state. So how does God judge then this nation state, the civil magistrate? And there's basically three answers in the history of Protestantism. The first is that God judges a nation state, a civil magistrate, as a corporate moral person. And that's like such a word salad. Corporate moral person. It sounds like a Alan Parsons Project album or something. It's just a weird phrase. But let's break it up really simply. Corporate, right? We think of corporation. But the word corporate simply means a group, a group that's now unified. And so a corporation, if you file as a corporation, what you're basically saying is, I want the government to treat me and Jason and Sam and Nick as one entity. That's all a corporation is we're telling the government that we now have an association that we're asking you to judge as a single entity. And so when you incorporate, what that means is we have a business, Cool Dudes International. And whatever Cool Dudes International does, they don't get to sue Sam. They don't get to sue me. They have to sue Cool Dudes International because that's the corporation. The Presbytery of Southern California is incorporated, right? And that's very important because that means that if the federal government wanted to start getting persecuted, they couldn't sue me. They would have to sue the Presbytery of Southern California. So that's what a corporation is simply a group of people wanting to be judged together. And now we use that for businesses because who pays taxes? When Coca-Cola sells 5 billion Coke cans, Charles Coca-Cola III doesn't pay those taxes. The Coca-Cola Corporation pays those taxes. So corporations are necessary for civil society. It's just people banding together to be one thing. And then the idea that it's moral is that idea that moral judgments can be made against it. It can either have righteousness or unrighteousness is what morality is about. And then a person is to say it's a question of agency, right? A person has agency. And so you can properly speak of a person doing something is a kind of very classic Greek philosophy way of describing this. So the first answer is that God judges the civil magistrate, the nation state, as a corporate moral person. And so God can judge America because the civil magistrate, the nation state that's known as the United States of America, God can judge that corporate entity as Lord. He can say, I am displeased, not with the Americans, but I am displeased with the United States of America as a corporation. I can judge it morally because it has agency, it can do things. So would it be right to say that God is angry? Here's the question is God angry at the United Kingdom? That's a really helpful country to use for this. Because you'll never meet a United Kingdomer. That's one of the few non-nation state civil magistrates we have is the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is actually made up of 4 distinct nations. Do you know what they are? England, Wales, Scotland, and a little part of Ireland. There's some debates about that. You can read about it. So there are 4 nations inside the state that is the United Kingdom. Is God angry at the United Kingdom? Or is God angry at the English? Or is God angry at Charles III? That's how we're kind of phrasing this question. I'm glad. I didn't say God's happy with Charles III. I kind of didn't give you a lot of options there. There are good reasons for the Lord to be upset, right? You've been following what's going on in the United Kingdom. They put people in jail for praying now. This is multiple instances. One actually happened this week. There was someone praying out loud, but praying in public, and they were arrested on Monday because they were just praying honestly for revival and for the Muslims in England to turn into Christians. And this person was arrested. They were technically arrested for resisting a police officer, but it's because the police officer came and told them, you don't get to pray. And they said, I'm going to keep praying. And then there was the magistrate took action against them. So clearly we can go, God is upset with that. I don't think I have to prove to you that God is upset when people are stopped from praying to him, right? So who is God holding responsible for that? Right? So one answer is God is angry at the United Kingdom because the United Kingdom is a corporate moral person. The next argument is that God is angry, and just again, this is a very specific example, but maybe God is angry, God holds judgment on, God holds wrath against the United Kingdom, not as a moral person, but as a what we call moral preserver, or the job of the magistrate is moral preservation. So the civil magistrate is being judged not as a person who can either be righteous or unrighteous, but because they have not done their job in preventing unrighteousness. Right? So it's not so much that they're the moral agent that's guilty of it, but that there is judgment for their failure to perform a task. It's a difference. We'll get into the specifics. And then the third would be, no, God's not angry at the United Kingdom, either as a person or as an arbiter. God is just mad at the English. Like these groups of people. God is mad at the police officer that stopped him. And God is mad at the judge that upheld the bobbies. That's what they call policemen there. God is upset at the bobby. He's upset at the judge. He's upset at each individual member of parliament for creating laws that allow these things. That's the kind of third position. Then we're going to do, perfectly on time, 7 o'clock, what we did last week, is we're just going to then get into it ourselves and have a good old-fashioned back and forth. Before I get there, I'm going to give you a case study, and then we're going to debate it as a group. Are there any questions about these categories? Mr. Graham?
Are those 3 mutually exclusive?
So kind of my point was not necessarily. Right now, they are borderline interchangeable, right? Like right now, in our political philosophy world, because of things like the Treaty of Westphalia and Treaty of Vienna, when an average American says the word nation, they probably mean both nation and state and civil magistrate. They've become a whole group term. But for this, we can actually say, no, is God judging a nation, again, not kinism, not the white people. God's not judging the white people. But is God just individually judging all the members of the nation? That's kind of the third one here. Is God judging the state as an apparatus? It's just not doing its job. So it's an institution, a person. Or is God judging the civil magistrate, the person, as a corporate moral person for his failures? So in the same way, is it Charles III? That's the civil magistrate. He is the civil magistrate in England. Is it the United Kingdom? Is it the state as a moral arbiter? Or is it he's just mad at all of these sinners in this area? Again, mad is, I hope you guys know what I mean by that. So that's my question is, that the truth is that language is subject to something called common usage. And so the more people use the word, the more the meaning changes. So I wanted to give you the biblical definition. By and large, when the Bible uses the word nation, it's referring to people groups, ethnos, not a civil magistrate, not a state, a bureaucratic state. But nowadays, we just have to wrap our head around the fact that those terms are very interchangeable. And that's just the way, that's the way the cookie crumbles. Any more questions about these categories? Back and forth? No? Okay. Next week, we're going to be talking about history. And the book I really want to commend you is a book called Religion and Republic by Miles Smith. Miles Smith is a ACNA, Reformed Anglican history professor at Hillsdale, which is a generally conservative leading institution. And in particular, it's going to be the second half of the class, is very, very focused on, he's an excellent historian, very focused on what is the history of Christianity in the state from 1776 to 1861. Because we all know there's a big change there for a lot of reasons, or really 1865. But early on in the chapter, he quotes Charles Hodge. Charles Hodge is a very important theologian for us as Reformed people, but he also just, if we're going to be honest and be good historians, he has a very outsized impact on America. He was extremely well known in his time. He was considered one of the most important thinkers of his day. So Charles Hodge makes an argument, and we're not going this direction. I know maybe you all want to. We're not going to go here. But as a way of introducing our issue for tonight, to legislate, is the government a corporate moral person? How do I think about this? Is Charles Hodge publishes a lengthy argument against immigration. Charles Hodge in 1830 he wants less immigration. We need to stop with the immigration. There's too much. It's not going well. What group does he not want to be allowed to emigrate to the United States of America? Okay, wow, there's a lot of answers. I heard Irish. The Irish fall into this group, but it's not because they're Irish. Huh? Catholics are a main subset of the group, which is really non-Protestants. So Catholics are the main non-Protestants at the time, but there are Muslims. Muslims exist in 1830. There are Jews. Jews exist in 1830. There are just non-Christians. Atheists exist in 1830. I guess, yeah, Sikh or Buddhist, I don't know what we want to talk about. So in 1830, Charles Hodge publishes a very lengthy argument against non-Protestant immigration. So when we said Irish, there are some Irish that Charles Hodge very much wanted to come to America. It was the Northern Irish. It was the Ulstermen, the Protestants. Historically, actually very Presbyterian, Northern Ireland is. So he would have been fine with them. So Hodge is saying we need to stop letting non-Protestants into this country. And he says, kind of famously, not anymore. At the time, he says, oh no. He doesn't say oh no. Well, he did say oh no. He was very upset. I'm worried about my marker. Okay, you guys can kind of see this. So he argues at length in a letter that was sent to members of Congress and the president at the time, who I believe was James K. Polk. He says, America is a Sabbath-keeping nation. And he goes on a great length that the reason America is a great country, I'm not making any of this up, the reason America is a great country is because we as a nation, that's the word he uses, we as a nation keep the Sabbath. And if we allow people into our nation, and he is kind of using it biblically, he's talking about Americans. He's not talking about the civil magistrate. He's not talking about the president. He's saying we are a nation of Sabbath keepers. He even makes the example. The French are people who speak French. The Germans are people, he goes, who are very industrious. Who are Americans? And Charles Hodge says Americans are those who keep the Sabbath. And his concern is that the great glut of immigration at the time was primarily Irish, but it was primarily Irish Catholics because of the potato famine and all these kind of things going on. That's actually a little bit later. But there's a glut of, in the I think it might be more on 1840, but around this time, the two main immigrants coming into America are the Irish and the, anyone know? Not the Germans. Germans are earlier. Germans are a turn of the century. Not the Italians yet. Italians are after the war. Abraham Lincoln actually signs a law in 1861 forbidding the immigration of anyone from this country into America, and it holds for about 20 years. The Chinese immigration, right? It's just, the more things change, the more they change the same. If you look up Chinese immigration in America in the middle of the 1800s, they're taking our jobs. It's Ecclesiastes, nothing new under the sun. So the two main immigrant groups around the middle of the 1800s are the Irish and the Chinese, neither of whom are by and large Protestant. And so Charles Hodge's concern is not that the Chinese have darker colored skin or that the Irish have lighter colored skin. His concern is not for the mores of the Irish culture or the mores of the Chinese culture. Actually, Hodge goes on to say he appreciates how industrious both the Chinese and the Irish are, which is not like a thing you usually hear about the Irish in history, but fair enough, right? He goes, I appreciate how hardworking the Chinese are. They come here, they work hard, I appreciate that. I don't want them here because they don't keep the Sabbath. Is his long argument. Fascinating article. So, here is our question. Even if you don't agree, maybe you're visiting, maybe you're still coming to convictions, let's say we're going to take this as a shared agreement. So even if this is a thought exercise for you, and you're not quite here, but for the purpose of legislating this issue, how do we judge a government? Let's all at least pretend right now that we agree that America is or ought to be a Sabbath-keeping nation, a Sabbath-keeping state, or a civil magistrate. This is what we're going to get into, right? So the question now we're going to ask is, I want to ask, how do we make America a Sabbath-keeping nation? But that's the wrong question, because we're going to get into policy. That was the previous week, or 2 weeks ago. Whose fault is it? Here's what we're going to ask. Whose fault is it that we're not a Sabbath-keeping nation? That's the question right now. Because, by the way, that's inarguable. We are no longer a Sabbath-keeping nation. If you go back east, what you will find is all of the original 13 colonies and most of the next 12 states all actually have, to this day, Sabbath laws. They're called blue laws. They're actually tied to alcohol, but usually it's that you cannot buy alcohol on Sunday. But there are other regulations. Does the United States Postal Service deliver on Sunday? And the answer is, unfortunately, yeah, they actually do. Trump changed that. Trump was the one who rolled that back. He argued, we need to roll it back, we need to change that. Now the Postal Service is more and more. But for the longest time, the answer is no. Can federal or state governments execute a criminal on Sunday? No. There has never been a death penalty execution on Sunday in the United States of America. It's not because of football, right? So it would get in the way of the Browns-Giants game. We can't do that. The last vestigial remnant of Sabbath keeping in the American public consciousness, if you're not from back east, you're probably unaware of blue laws. And even then, it's very possible that people don't really think of them more as alcohol laws than Sabbath laws. What would be, as a group of people, we'd say, if Americans have a concept of the Sabbath, where do they probably get it from? Chick-fil-A. That's just true, right? Kanye West wrote a whole song about it. So Chick-fil-A is kind of our only national consciousness for the idea that you should be closed on Sunday. So who is responsible? Don't say the Chinese or the Irish. We talked about why that's the bad answer. Who is responsible for America no longer being a Sabbath-keeping nation? The churches. Okay, great. First answer. The churches. Can we see this? Okay. Yeah. If I put some moisture on it, will that help? All right, so either Mark or someone else, build out why are the churches culpable for Americans not being a Sabbath-keeping nation? Why are the churches the ones that we're holding guilty for America not being a Sabbath-keeping nation? Right, so the argument would be, what we would call ministerial authority. So, the argument here is, who is primarily responsible for advocating, convincing, teaching what Sabbath keeping is to be? And one argument is, that's primarily the ministerial authority of the church, therefore they're the ones guilty for it not happening. Right? Sabbath keeping is primarily the ministerial authority. We say ministerial because we've talked about before, Romans talks about the government as a minister of the Lord, as a servant of the Lord. But ministerial here means, in a sense, spiritual, that you have authority over spiritual things, which we've talked about before, that no Protestant is what we would call an Erastian. Protestantism is wholly against the idea that the government, the nation state, the civil magistrate should have 100% control over spiritual affairs. No Protestant has ever believed that. That's a fundamentally Catholic position. And so, or actually the opposite of the Catholic position, but it's called Erastianism. It was a non-reformed, kind of like, anyway, get into the Erastians. So when I say ministerial authority, the argument here is that spiritual authority has invested in the church, and so the church is responsible for the failure to keep a spiritual habit. There's one or two other kind of arguments. Why is the church is primarily responsible for us not being a Sabbath-keeping people? Any thoughts? Or maybe you come up, see, we could be contributing to political theology. Maybe you come up with a new good argument, and I will call Crossway. And trust me, you want a Crossway contract. If you're going to publish, you want Crossway money. So we'll have Abraham call Crossway for us if you have a good argument. Why else might it be primarily the churches who are responsible? Any thoughts? Sam?
Did they just stop considering it important?
Right. So what we would call here is, I'm using Sam's argument, theological decline. So this could just be attributed to what? Laziness? Cowardice? There could be a lot of reasons why you're not exercising your spiritual authority. But now we're going to say it's just theological decline. They just no longer believe it's important. Right? And so what we're fundamentally saying here, right, is that the main way to make a nation moral is theological. That theology is the first and main arbiter of whether or not a people are moral people. And therefore the churches, who are theological arbiters, because again, we're not Erastians, even if you think the civil magistrate should be involved in ecclesiastical affairs, which is a prevalent opinion in Protestant political theology, but even then, the true arbiter of theological matters, every Protestant can say is the church. And so what this is basically saying is we don't have Sabbath because the primary ones who make people moral, which is the church, have decline in their ability to do that, right? Mark?
So is that not the people, the congregants, not having the salt and light amongst the rest of society? Is that
You are one step ahead of me. So no one listen to what Mark just said, because I want to get there on a big reveal. Which one of these answers are we? Still up there? Good. Any more arguments? There's kind of one more I think of. Maybe we can go there. Yes, Aaron? Yes. This is a way to talk about mission creep. Appeasement compromises mission creep. That I have a job other than the theological and ministerial job God's given me. And so I'm going to sacrifice that. Appeasement, compromise, mission creep. I'm going to sacrifice that. So it's not that I'm a coward. It's not my theology is bad. It's that I've now added something wrong. I'm going in the wrong direction. It's my job to make the Tigers happy. Well, when you're in the Coliseum, you're not going to make the Tigers happy. They're not there to make you happy. So the argument here is that basically it's the church not doing its job, not understanding its job, or doing the wrong job, right? Fundamentally, right, if you're saying that it is primarily the church's fault that America's a nation, you are talking about institutions then as the second option, as moral preservation. So it's your job to keep the Sabbath, right? Churches can't help but keep the Sabbath. When do we meet, right? I don't know how a church would, if a church opened a business, like if Providence OBC opened Providence Brewing, and we're like, we're here to make beer, and by the way, we're only making beer on Sunday, and we're only selling beer on Sunday, I guess then we would be, the thing. But the idea here is this argument is that institutions, be it the church, the civil magistrate, whatever institutions you believe, fundamentally exist to preserve the moral order and to pass it on, right? So it's not that the churches can't create Sabbath obedience, in a sense, right? Like, I could preach till I'm blue in the face, and Sam could still decide not to be a Sabbatarian. But my job is, as an institution, come on, Sam. My job as an institution is it's my job to tell him to keep the Sabbath. I have to maintain the theology and give him the theology to keep the Sabbath, and I need to not do other things. And so that's a second position, that it's a church, a civil magistrate. And so you could even say here, in a similar sense, and this was my clever reveal that Mark got ahead of, is who's supposed to be keeping it? Well, the people are supposed to be keeping it. But if it's the church or the civil magistrate, or, who else technically has an authority over other people and can encourage them or discourage them to keep the Sabbath? Parents. The argument at the end of the day is a parent can't really make a child a Sabbath keeper because I can't make you worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. That happens in your heart. But it is my institution as a parent to preserve the Sabbath as an option for you, by bringing you to church, by not letting you get a job, whatever. And so that's all these things. You could say church, but all these things you could say, basically we have authority, we have right doctrine, we have no mission creep, and it's my job to preserve Sabbath keeping without either legislating it or saying, actually, I have no duty. It's not my job, it's your job. And I'm going to just, I'll leave it open. Who else could we blame? So the churches, but anything we're saying kind of like institutionally, they haven't done the job of promoting Sabbath keeping, of allowing Sabbath keeping to be a thing. Who else could we say it's your fault we're not keeping the Sabbath? Jason. Good. Businesses. Businesses. It's like Mississippi. The key with spelling Mississippi right is you just keep adding S's, and it always works out, I promise. Businesses. Why is it businesses' fault that we're not a Sabbath-keeping people?
Because they operate.
Right. So, how about they're breaking the Sabbath, right? Like they're actively doing it. It's your fault. Your tire shop's open on the Lord's Day. Your widget shop. Was it we were talking about widgets? Yeah. As like the kind of stand-in for economy. Stop running your widget shop on Sunday. It's your fault. That's why we're not Sabbath-keeping people, is because you're not keeping the Sabbath. What's another argument that it's business's fault? So they're breaking the Sabbath. Why else are they making us not a Sabbath-keeping nation? This is kind of related. You might go, that's the same thing, but I think it is technically a separate thing. Football. To quote Bobby Boucher, foosball. You're attempting me to not keep the Sabbath. Not only are you playing foosball on the Lord's Day, but you're making me want to watch the foosball because I want to watch Lamar Jackson. He's like a different, whatever athleticism he has is not common to mankind, right? That guy is a freak in the best sense of the word. I want to watch that guy run across the field. So you're breaking the Sabbath is also then, which is, we're not getting into this, but this is the idea of Jeremy Bentham, positive and negative liberty, right? So I am breaking the Sabbath, but by my Sabbath breaking, I'm enticing you to also break the Sabbath, right? And so by selling just the best widget, and I'm right in front of you, hey, buy this widget, you need this widget, now you're enticing me. Or by putting a really great product in the field, right? Seahawks, I don't even remember who was the other team. The Pats. Seahawks versus Patriots. Do you want to watch that? It's a rematch of the other Super Bowl where they did the football and it was a big deal. Oh, I got to watch it. And there's going to be a big musical artist, Bad Bunny. Don't you want to see Bad Bunny? Don't you want to learn who he is? Watch it. It's a temptation. What's the third reason? They're breaking it simply by doing it. They're tempting me to do it. It's right direction, but let's not go kind of doing like outside the civil magistrate for now. But what do lawmakers have the ability to do is to force me to do something? Making, enforcement, absolutely. So it's not simply that you're breaking it or that you're tempting me to break it. It's that you can actually make me do it. You're my boss. Ashley's my boss. Anyway. We're not egalitarian. I just want to clear that up. Yeah, okay. Scrubbing this. We're going to hire Eli. He's going to fix that up. I'm clearly the boss. Let's see, Ashley McMickle. We've never met. We're not married. I work for Ashley McMickle at Arrowhead Hospital. Hospital's a bad one because we think hospitals should be open. For American Widgets, Ashley McMickle runs and operates American Widgets Incorporated, and I work for her, and she says, listen, come in on Sunday or you're going to lose your job. I go, oh, it's really hard. I have kids to feed. I also said I would work here. What do I do? And she goes, you're not just going to lose your job. I'm going to sue you for breach of contract. How about that? How about it's not just you're going to lose your job. I'm going to sue you for everything you're worth for breach of contract. You promised that you'd work when I told you to. I'm going to come after your house. I'm enforcing you to work. Right? Can businesses do that? Yes. Have businesses done that? Yes, they have done that. There are court cases. There's a company not far from us in Scottsdale called the Alliance Defending Freedom. And they're primarily a Christian legal group that defends Christians. And they have in the past 5 years had multiple lawsuits over false termination and suing for breach of contract over Sabbath keeping, right? Where people were fired for keeping the Sabbath, even though this country has religious exemptions, and they're not allowed to fire you for that. But there are some contract laws beyond me. Did not graduate law school. So these are the three things. Fundamentally, business is here as a stand-in for this third position, that what God is upset about is peoples. Just people, right? Ashley McMickle, owner, God is righteously angry because she's working on the Lord's Day, and that's who the judgment is against. And he's upset at Ashley McMickle of American Widgets because she's tempting me to buy a widget, or she's suing me and forcing me to work on the Lord's Day. So the idea here, this is what it looks like to say, actually, God is just mad at individuals, God is judging individuals. And so it's not America that's in trouble for me working on the Lord's Day, nor is it institutions that are in trouble. It's not Charles III's fault. It's not the United Kingdom's fault. It's Ashley's fault. And that's a picture of this idea, right? That it's fundamentally individuals making the wrong decisions that have now led us to be a non-Sabbath keeping nation. All right. Whose fault is it? I kind of gave you the answer I wanted earlier. I mentioned a policy that's recently changed. Whose fault is it that we're not a Sabbath-keeping nation? Specifically, who is Donald J. Trump? It's his fault. That's very popular these days, right? Like it's always his fault. So I'm just going to join in on the chorus. By the way, he does bad things. I'm not unaware that a lot of things are his fault. But surely, no one's going to be mad online if I say it's Trump's fault. Like, I've successfully appeased the peoples. It's Big Orange Man's fault. Donald J. Trump's fault that we're not a Sabbath-keeping people. Make the argument. By the way, it's there. Like, as much as I'm kind of joking about the cultural milieu, this is not a hard argument to make. Why is it Trump's fault we're not a Sabbath-keeping people?
Because he doesn't keep the Sabbath.
Okay, absolutely right. Our government is called a federal government. We have federal representation. When people in England think of America, let's be honest, they think of Trump. And 8 years ago, they thought of Barack Obama. I don't know the years. You know what I mean. I think it was 8 years ago, right? 10? Oh, man. It's rough getting old. I recommend not getting old if it's an option to you. Actually, it's pretty great. Donald Trump is the federal head. He is the head of our government. Who is the head of the British government? You ever know the Prime Minister's name in Britain right now? Keir Starmer. He talks like he can't open his mouth. His teeth are always clenched. Is Keir Starmer the head of the British government? No, he's not. Who is the head of the British government? King Charles III. That's another really good picture of who the head of the government is. He is the federal, like he is the arbiter of the United Kingdom, is the king. Right? It's very different than our system where the elected representative is also the head of the government. For us, in American federalism, the president is the head of the government. He's the head of the military. He's the head of the government. And so as the federal head, his personal piety affects us. It matters to us. It hurts us or it blesses us, right? Another argument, why is it Donald John Trump's fault? Jason? Right, so we go with, what did we just talk about was the U.S. Post Office. He has consistently argued that more government people should be working on Sunday. And this is coming, obviously he's not a Sabbatarian Christian, if he's a Christian at all. I mean, by his own admission, he's like, I don't think I'm getting to heaven, which Christians should not say. I know we all want to be humble, but that's not what the gospel is. He said he might get in heaven because he ends the Ukraine war. Again, not something a Christian would say. I hope he does end the Ukraine war, by the way. He has consistently lobbied for the federal government to open up on Sunday. And, we know where he's coming from, right? He's a businessman. He cares about productivity. It's one of the things I legitimately appreciate about him, right? He cares about people doing their job well, which is what you have to do when you're a businessman. So he pushes for efficiency, he pushes for controls, pushes for accountability, and in his mind, not working on Sunday is lazy. I mean, he said it. You can find clips of him saying the U.S. Post Office is lazy. Whether or not that's true, I don't know. I don't know any post office workers, but he has consistently pushed for Sabbath breaking. So in his authority as a civil magistrate, he should be responsible for getting the post office to work on Sunday. His personal Sabbath breaking is important to us. What would be the third? These two are kind of connected. I'll be honest, I'm stretching a little bit, because these are really, at the end of the day, the kind of two arguments for this position. But this is, I think, a step down from this idea that he's our federal head. Another reason why it's his fault that we're not who you want? Barack Obama, James K. Polk, James Garfield. You're a big anti-Garfield guy. Why is it his fault that we're not a Sabbath-keeping people? Any ideas? As a subset of this one?
He doesn't lead by example.
Exactly. There's an old saying, the fish rots from the head down. As the leader goes, so goes the people. It's a universal common grace truth. If we have a president who is the leader of our country, it's going to have an outsized effect on the people in that country. We're going to follow his example. So not only is he personally culpable, and his culpability for God affects us, as the argument goes, but also he makes us want to be like him. Is there any argument, by the way, that Donald John Trump has not refashioned the Republican Party in his own image? No. As far as being a political leader he is outrageously effective. He has single-handedly reshaped one of America's two political parties in his own image. And the last person to do that was probably Franklin Delano Roosevelt, right? That's what we're talking about, like how monolithic Trump is. If we're being honest, as a figure in American history, do you guys have big opinions on Millard Fillmore? You don't? Okay. Do you think people in 100 years will care about Donald Trump? Yes. In a lot of ways, his closest historical parallel is Andrew Jackson, who, going back to this time, was a monumental figure, right? Between the year of 1810 to 1860, Andrew Jackson is the most important person in America. He has this huge impact in America. So Trump's there. So we would say, not just because of his actions or his laws, but he formed us in his image. So now we figured out, but what we're saying here is that because of the civil head, because of the civil magistrate, there's an argument that the government, the nation's civil magistrate, is a corporate, moral person. That as the civil magistrate goes, so goes the country, and God's going to judge the civil magistrate. Not just Donald Trump as a person, but as the arbiter for a country. And so as the office of the President of the United States, I forget what number he is, 48? No. 47. And 45. He is too, which actually is the correct numbering of the way we consider administrations. He is the 47th administration. The argument is, as the 47th administration goes, that's what God is judging. And we see the evidence of it here. Right? We're at 7:30. In summary, this is similar to the last week's question, right, of should the government enforce the first table of the law, right? What authority does the government have to punish, not punish? All of these three positions are very well represented in both American Presbyterian history and in Reformed theology. Proponents of this position, I said before I don't use Calvin because everyone claims Calvin. This This one would be a hard one to claim for Calvin. The famous ones here, Samuel Rutherford, Johannes Althusius, who's a very important political theologian. Proponents of this position we talked about before. This is the history of Southern Presbyterianism, which is why it's very grassroots. So Thornwell, and specifically R.L. Dabney, argues for this very vociferously, that God judges individuals. We talked about last week also, this would be the position of a guy named Hugo Grotius. So there's a Dutch Reformed tradition. If you were wondering what was the guy who asked this question, this is the position of both Hodges, AA, and Charles Hodge. Other political thinkers, there's a very important Anglican whose book was the main book I drew from here, called Oliver O'Donovan. It's called The Desire of the Nations. What does God want for the nations? What do the nations want? This would be O'Donovan's position. O'Donovan's very, very, very influential in modern kind of Protestant political theology. All right, questions about all these things?